Welcome, friends. How's everybody doing? How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing good, Dave. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man, good to be with you. We're really excited to be sharing all these conversations and be back with another episode of Left Reckoning 196, Class Dealignment after the Kamala election crash. We're going to be talking a little bit more about the election in just a little bit. We're also going to be talking a bit about mental health and the crisis for mental health workers. Really looking forward to taking a deep dive into that in just a little while. Just want to let folks know we got a couple of really exciting things coming up. We're going to be releasing our conversation with Kurt Hackbarth and Jose Luis that we had a couple weeks back about Mexico and what went right in that context versus what went wrong in Kamala's electoral campaign. So keep your eye out for that. I think that'll be coming out in the next couple of days for people who aren't patrons, but you should be a patron, patreon.com/leftreckoning to get that and get access to post-game Sunday shows and all that good stuff. But before we get to all these conversations, Matt, there's some really exciting news. I think something that will put a smile on your face, which is the Teamsters keep on winning, and they are on a full-out frontal assault on Amazon. And the victories keep on coming. And I want to share this video for everyone listening, for everyone watching, to see what is possible. This is something that I'm sure many of our listeners would love to participate one day, which is marching on your boss. So these are workers in Atlanta marching on their managers at an Amazon facility.
Who are we? Teamsters! Who are we? Teamsters! Who are we? Teamsters! Who are we? Teamsters! Now, don't walk away now. Who are we? Teamsters! 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 Who are we? Teamsters!
And that's extremely exciting. That's working class people winning. And we're going to continue having these conversations on Left Reckoning today over the next couple of weeks about what happened politically. But I don't want anyone to take their eye off of the ball, because that is the real fight. And that is the way that we're going to change politics in this country. We're going to change life in this country, is getting power back into working class people's hands. And one of the best ways to do that is to join a union fight and win, like these folks in Atlanta are doing.
Yeah, and it's nice to have someone like the Teamsters behind it, coordinating it on a national level too, because it's one thing to organize individual in a very bifurcated and separate, like a chain where supply chains are very sort of like inscrutable and who owns what. Having, okay, you're an Amazon worker, we're the union for Amazon people. Like, I mean, that's such a promising thing, and you can understand why. I think it was never hard to understand why, when the Teamsters endorsement decision, they hedged their bets because the Democrats were fucking losers and they had business to attend to in the event that they lost, and they did. So like, I think, do better next time would be my advice to any political party that wants their endorsement.
I mean, just like, this is the reality right now, is that history is open, and things aren't settled. And the non-endorsement from the Teamsters, I think, was a very significant moment in American politics and in labor politics. And we'll see how it turns out. But I'll tell you, that's a union that has a tremendous amount of mobilization and enthusiasm and opportunity to grow. That is a union that is on the rise, and it's one that needs to be taken seriously, particularly by Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And very excited to continue covering those fights and seeing those victories, because, man, if you can think of anyone who deserves a large group of angry Teamsters marching on them, it is Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, and somebody mentioned, well, they have certain bad attitudes about individual X or Y, when it was pointed out by, I think it was Austin Alman, that one of the conditions that they wanted for an endorsement of Harris was to keep on Lena Khan. And Harris is too tied to Silicon Valley to have made that promise. And so that was one, in which, if she would have made that promise and O'Brien got the Teamsters to endorse her, it would have been over a lot of his membership's desires, right? And it's just like, she couldn't even go that far to have him do something to pay that price for it. And like that stuff needs to be clear, because all this stuff I'm seeing about, they got the bailout, they got this, that. First of all, that should be a matter of fucking course. That should not be a, well, what's in it for us that we did that. You should, if you are the Labor Party, which, you know, Democrats are kind of shy about actually calling themselves that, but to the extent that you have labor in your coalition, that should be fucking obvious. You should not be like Zionists now saying, hey, I was at your Black Lives Matter march. Where is my support for a current genocide? It's like, no, wake the fuck up.
No, I mean, look at the people who are high up in the Harris campaign when it comes to like making decisions and giving that campaign advice. Was it organized labor? Was it people with those kind of backgrounds, or was it freaks from Uber? You know, and it's just like at a certain point, you don't need, you know, you don't need, you know, too much to understand where exactly that political party and that political candidate stood on all those kind of issues.
You don't need Russia to hack their emails, for instance.
Oh man. Well, folks, we're going to have a lot of time to rage, you know, throughout this episode. Really, really great conversations. I know Matt's going to take us through those in just a second, but I want to let everybody know about a very exciting announcement that we have in Left Reckoning, which is new merch. We got our new Left Reckoning ball caps. We also have a really cool embroidered fence cutter t-shirt, along with a big text t-shirt. Now, all of our original merch is also still available. We have our big text tank. We have our fence cutter sweatshirt. And then also the iconic Left Reckoning black and yellow cap. You can get all that at leftreckoning.com/store. And yeah, we're really excited to seeing all that out. And when you get your stuff, folks, as always, you know, please tag us on Instagram, Twitter, all that, and we'd love to share those posts of seeing y'all out in the world in our thing. In your exclusive Left Reckoning merch. So jump on that, friends.
Yeah, and if people didn't like the big text design, for instance, but didn't want to show off the guns in a tank top, we now have that available as a t-shirt. So
sleeves on. But yeah, so we're going to be joined in just a second by Briana Last and Lillian Cicerchia to talk about the labor in the mental health world, as well as what happened with the Kamala Harris campaign. So stick around, enjoy those conversations, and then immediately after that, patreon.com/Left Reckoning, join Matt and I for the postgame. Will be
talking about a new spokesperson for AI. Who might have a secret weapon that, say, the men who have been promoting it as a way to do all sorts of scams are missing, which is that she's a woman and appears to have a social life. So it's pretty dangerous stuff. Yeah, patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
Oh, yeah. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man, and we're really thrilled to be joined today. I mean, so look, people who've been tuning in for the past few weeks know that we're still diving deep into what happened in this most recent election and what it means for the future. And to do that, we've been wanting to bring in the smartest people that we know, and one of those people is certainly our good friend, Lillian Cicerchia. You know her as a regular guest on this program, and also What's Left of Philosophy. Lillian, thank you so much for coming on and joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about the election instead of philosophy. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to get into, and you know, this election really does feel like the culmination of a lot of like political and social trends, and I was wanting I wanted to hear your general thoughts about the election, but as somebody who I know has had a lot of criticisms of the Harris campaign, of the Biden administration, of the way the Democratic Party does politics, I was curious if you had any thoughts about so basically there are a few different theses about like why they lost this election, right? There's maybe the more materialist one that is sort of looking at what people are saying in exit polls, saying I voted on the economy. And looking at, you know, the different demographics of people who voted for Trump instead of Harris. There's a kind of race angle, and there's a gender angle. And I was just curious, as somebody, you know, who we've had on to talk about socialist feminism, for example, what your response is to people who are sort of couching the Kamala Harris loss in misogyny.
Well, I think that first of all, when it comes to like the woman vote, there just isn't one woman vote. You know, there's like there is, for as long as feminism has existed, it has had to deal with the fact that there are genuinely conservative women, and there are different theories about why some women are conservative, and there are different social influences on that conservatism. But I think that an interesting thing about this is that actually a lot the issues that she said, like that Kamala spoke most confidently on, which were reproductive rights, didn't persuade, like that's actually a popular thing. Like reproductive rights is popular, and like I think, is it 7 out of 10 referenda the conservatives have lost on abortion, and like the ones they've lost or the ones they've won, like was it Florida, where like
and
the
Florida
bar
had
was
like
really
a high
high,
threshold,
like
over
60%
60%.
or something.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you have these red states. So as it turns out, people don't want abortion to be illegal. Everything I've ever read in terms of like public opinion polling or from the Guttmacher Institute, which does like reproductive rights research, shows that this is true, that basically Americans have a range of like boundaries with abortion, but very few people actually want it to be illegal. And so these lose. And then these women are also voting for Trump. And then she also is losing on other issues. And it just wasn't enough to flip the balance. And I just think like the problem is that she lacks credibility, and the Democratic Party lacked credibility. Mm-hmm. So this is the reason I'm pointing out the abortion issues. I think she lacks credibility on a whole number of issues, and women also care about those. But assume you are a woman who cares about reproductive rights, which many are, and many young women were like polled as saying they cared about that. Then why would you not show out for somebody when that was the only coherent thing she ever talked about? Like that was when she was most confident, most clear, most inspiring, because clearly she actually believed what she was saying. Well, she lacks credibility because the Democratic Party does in general. Like they didn't do anything to stop the Dobbs like what the outcome of the Dobbs decision. I think it's plain to like most people that the abortion issue has been taken off of the federal stage, and that has been because of 50 years of Democratic strategy, like legal strategies that have been fundamentally defensive and not progressive and democratic, and like actually having gaining legitimacy for these policies with the public. So I think that's one example of maybe why I wouldn't say that this is about misogyny. It's just like, if you don't think the politician is gonna do the thing I care about, then most people don't care what color you are or what gender you are. They just like want the person they think is going to do it. And she didn't appear to be that person. And I guess I think there's probably I think it would be wrong to say that some of the ways she was talked about were not sexist, but I think it's trivializing to like make that put the weight on, like make that the scale changer of the whole thing. I doubt that that's true.
Yeah, Adam Gentleson, who's getting he's going at the left a lot. He's a John Fetterman advisor. Before the election, he said, there has not been a rollback of an individual right on the scale of Dobbs for half a century, and tomorrow's results are going to show that. They did not show that. No. And those people relied on that to such an extent that I feel like it's an understated like political crime, that they thought they could just put that in their back pocket, support like a genocide. And to me, like the 1-to-1 that they want voters to do of, you put our guy in the White House or gal, and we get the judiciary for you. Well, Barack Obama was in the White House and when Scalia died. I remember a clip between Aiden Ross and Kai Cenat, two very popular Twitch streamers, where Aiden Ross said, well, Joe Biden got rid of abortion because it was under his watch, right? Like, and I don't think that I blame the Republican judiciary, but I agree with you about the credibility of the Democrats here and their inability to really fight for it. They don't have any credibility that they're actually going to do anything besides send you a fundraising email on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like I made some like snarky comment about voting third party or something on Twitter, which I rarely do. I rarely do the political stuff on Twitter, and I try to keep it theory-oriented. That's my lane. But I was just so pissed after that Biden debate before he dropped out that I was just like, for the love of God, abandon these people. And then somebody wrote back to me, like 3 or 4 people were in the comments like, but what about the Supreme Court and abortion? And I'm like, yo, they've been turned over. Like they have a 6-3 majority that's not coming back. How could you vote right now on debate? Like, what are they gonna do? Like whack somebody and get somebody new a couple times? It just didn't. And the thing is that it just didn't even like add up to, like, I was so shocked that this argument was still happening, where I was like, this made sense when there was a slim majority, or when it was in the balance, or when there was a new appointment coming up. This is not something that's going to flip over with any certain presidency. So the argument that this is going to drive national politics, and then they didn't do anything in the legislature anyway. So why would someone think you're not doing it now? Why would you do it in the next 4 years?
I mean, I think that the point about credibility is really apt. I mean, like here in Texas, we're actually are like experiencing like the horror of the abortion ban, right? I'm sorry, there was nothing in Kamala and Colin Allred certainly talked about abortion, but there was nothing in it that made anybody feel there's any reason to have any confidence that they were going to do anything about the state law in Texas, right? And in a lot of ways, the Democrats were trying to run the old playbook around abortion, which is, oh man, if the Republicans get in power, they're going to take this away from you, right? Which in red states or places where it has been taken away from people, right? That rings really hollow, right? Because it's very clear that like, oh, these people aren't going to fight for you. This is about other folks out there. And, you know, I don't think that played, I think that certainly played a role in suppressing the turnout in parts of Texas that they might have thought would have shown up stronger for Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I think another thing about, this is the last thing I'll say about the abortion issue, is that some people are pretty aware of like the constraints on what people can and can't do, and like legislatively. And it's probably dawned on a lot of women that like where there was the capacity to protect abortion rights, they've been protected. And then in the places where they were going to take away those rights, they did that. And clearly there can be a strategy from the bottom up to like try to have referenda and so on. And people might have just realized that slim as the chances for that in a place like Mississippi may be, it seems like a slimmer chance that the Democrats are going to protect their rights at a federal level, because they just haven't. So maybe enough people were like, fuck it, let's gamble, because no one's going to fix this, whatever.
Well, I mean, let's talk about the gamble here. I mean, first of all, I mean, you know, we dive right into this issue, Lillian. But like, I mean, what's your initial reaction, you know, to this result? I mean, not just the fact that Trump won, but like the groups that ended up coming out and supporting Trump.
You know, I feel very vindicated because I had a prediction come true. Not because I'm happy about it, but because like literally for like as soon as they nominated Kamala, I thought there was all that hope and joy stuff and that kind of Obamification at the DNC. And I was in Chicago at the time, and I tried to go to a protest, and I saw how small the protests were and how much her nomination deflated the whole thing, because I thought it was going to be about Palestine. And, you know, I've been to protests in Chicago before. I know what it looks like when it's just a local crowd. No, people were not bussed in to the extent that I thought they were going to be bussed in. You couldn't get anywhere near it. It was so tightly controlled and contained, and clearly like the political will to kind of like break the barriers, as it were, to like storm the United Center or the McCormick Place. That didn't happen because there's all the hopey, changey, joy stuff. And I think people would have been more outraged if it was another candidate. So I was like, look, this is either political speculation, and this is going to pay off because you're going to create this like bubble of enthusiasm, and this is going to work, or this is going to just like fall to the ground like a deflated hot air balloon. And maybe a month or two before, I was like, this is never going to work. If I know my chickens, they are not letting that woman get an inch to the White House, because she doesn't have any credibility. The Democrats don't have any credibility. And it was literally so undemocratic the way that she was elected, that I think there's just enough people who either didn't vote or were like, you know what, maybe something will change with Trump. I think that's it. I literally think it was a political gamble for a lot of people. I don't think that there has been like a solid realignment, like it's a clear coalition. I think this could oscillate, but I think that there's enough people that were like, I used to feel more sure that this was like the lesser evil, and now I don't feel sure anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point there about like the realignment, because that is like, the folks at Compact Magazine certainly are very excited, thinking that, there is now this union working class Republican Party, which is, I'm sorry, not true.
Bottle what
But
Trump's got, and then you can start talking. Figure out how to reproduce. Figure out how to reproduce what the sauce
Yeah,
Trump has
no,
with
I mean-
working voters, and then we'll start talking.
No, I think that's a fundamental point, right, man? Is that like I think only Donald Trump can sort of like embody these pretty ridiculous contradictions within his movement. But I think more than anything, it really is a culmination of what people call dealignment, which is that more and more working class voters don't see themselves in the Democratic Party, and I think I think the arguments that the working class voters are now Republican is kind of premature. But I do think that like there's a lot of variance and possibility and openness. And I'm just curious if you share that feeling, Lillian.
I think so. I think de-alignment is the better word than realignment. I don't think there's anything, it doesn't seem clear to me what the constituency of working class people looks like, and how that would remain stable as a part of a Republican coalition over time, because I don't think it's clear how Trump's coalition can remain stable. Like what the next generation of politicians looks like after him, I think is very unclear. But I do think that there's a lot of like there's a lot of openness in the sense that now the political parties know that they have to compete for the working class vote if they decide they care about it. And I think before this election, there was a coalition. I guess it would be called the New Deal coalition, but like whatever coalition was going on from the 90s until 2016, that was basically like the fumes of the previous era. I think that this is definitively gone into crisis and it can't stay like that. And that was a coalition in which the Democrats could rely on reliably labor as a kind of pliant part of its junior partner to what it was doing. And I think now this is something that is going to cause more self-reflection. And I don't know if it's going to be the right kind of self-reflection, like the Democrats try to win back working class votes. I think it's possible they don't, and they solidify a different coalition. But unlike before, where you could just kind of like the politicians could just kind of assume that labor was in its pocket because the Republicans were obviously worse, I think what Sean O'Brien did was break the fourth wall, as it were. Like he was like, I'm not going to endorse Trump, but I'm just going to see if anything catches. And I don't know if anything will. I kind of doubt it. But I think it's worthwhile to think of, I don't know, opportunity is a too optimistic way of putting this. I feel like I'm in hot water if I say opportunity. But there is an opportunity of some kind to think about, if you were in organized labor or organizing new people, to start advertising labor as something that is up for grabs, where you actually have to win your membership to a vision for an endorsement, which is which could be a democratization of the union election, if you can no longer just decide from the top that obviously we're going to endorse Democrats. Like, people deserve a say in what the politics of their unions are, and I think that's basically good.
I was just going to mention, we had Matt Karp on years ago now, was it? Talking about the Gilded Age as a time where the working class was de-aligned and not really in either party. And kind of for that, really, that's the reason I don't have any fealty to the Democratic Party. And if all of a sudden the working class realigned to the Republican Party, it's like, all right, guys, let's start trying to run
Party of
maybe
Lincoln.
on that ballot line. Yeah, exactly. Let's retake the Party of Lincoln. I just, at this point, it's like, I still think if you were going to use either of the ballot lines, it's probably going to get more traction on a Democratic one. But I'm interested in like Dan Osborne. He basically ran, he didn't win in Nebraska, but he got to a level of what you might expect from a Democratic incumbent running as a sort of labor independent. Like, do you think starting at like those, maybe a state level, is a way to like start organizing this stuff?
I think so. I mean, I think that I'm glad you said that, because I think having a more mercenary attitude towards these parties is a good thing. Matt Karp knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, but what I understand, I remember when I was in school, I had such a hard time understanding like the history of American parties, because I didn't even understand like what groups of people they were, because the two-party system, when it aligns and realigns, which it's done a few times in its history, it's actually like a very confusing. Sorry, my cats are running around. That's what that noise is. They're like, okay. That's actually a very confusing conglomeration of interests and tensions and compulsions. And I think that we kind of got used to seeing it in one of its versions, and we're all dealing with an 8-year-long shock of what if it turns into something else. And I think that we have to be honest with ourselves that it might turn into something else. And what we have to do as the left is try to have some kind of independence in the storm, because otherwise the working class will get split apart definitively. You'll have reactionary unions, I'm sure, progressive unions. The world might be more interesting in that way, but that's not good for labor. Labor should try to be on the same page politically. But if loyalty to the Democratic Party is preventing that because working class people are not seeing the payoff of that, then socialists have to start thinking about what they can do to earn credibility with working class people. And if that means independent fights, then that's a good thing. And if it means, a winnable Democratic ballot line, then that's a good thing. And honestly, if it means a winnable Republican seat, that's a good thing. I don't really care. I don't find that super likely given how reactionary most Republicans are. But if you were in a district where you really thought that you could have some working class politics and a Democrat, because it's a toxic brand, will never win, and it's just try it. I mean, I don't know, but I think that there's a way in which we can push and open this thing up if Socialists and Labor doesn't let the Democratic Party blackmail them into remaining hamstrung to what they're doing.
I think one thing too that is abundantly clear, that the blackmail politics that have sort of dominated the Democrats, but I mean, frankly, as you were talking about earlier, like the left. I mean, let's zoom in a little bit instead of zooming out, and let's talk about like our very small world. I mean, it's been particularly interesting these past 4 years to see what's happened amongst what we would call the left, right? The people who are behind Bernie Sanders. I think there's a section of folks who were sort of on the fence between Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, and both of them are great. She has great plans, but they like his speeches, whatever. And that line became really blurry between those people and like socialists, right? Let alone Bernie supporters. And these past 4 years, saw a whole section of this, and I know you and I have talked about this before, Lillian. The whole section of people on the left, just like praising every move that Joe Biden did. There was all these kind of fawning coverage of Biden, like, oh, Joe Biden is the reluctant FDR, all of this kind of stuff. So, I mean, how do we wage this fight on our side to like actually seem like we're building like a legitimate opposition instead of just, settling scores with people who pissed us off a couple of years back?
Or spiraling into, because there is a danger when you leave the kind of Democratic fold of becoming irrelevant. That's a real fear. And I know a lot of people who are like who've been in left-wing groups for their whole adult lives, have at some point gotten sick of not being relevant to others. And that is all to me a very legitimate fear. But the cost that like I'm talking about is that a lot of people hate that. They hate what this election showed is that the American public hates the Democratic Party. And it for a lot of different reasons, but they're not well liked. So there's a cost to staying in the fold when the conditions change. And I guess I would just like to remind people is that when the Bernie moment was happening, I was very aware of like all of the debates about the Democratic ballot line. And I remember some people saying, like, in a great frustration, like on the New York left, it was like, people cannot admit that it's happening. Something's happening. Something's changing. We got to try it. And over time, I was won over to that, maybe too late, actually, but I think that it was right to try it. I think it now is a time in which like some reevaluating is once again necessary, because sometimes I think about what has been going on in the past 8 years. It's like history got moving again in the United States, and we have to learn to think not in terms of just how static things felt for most of our childhoods, adolescence, like reevaluating every 4 to 8 years whether or not something is working is more like the tempo that we need to be at than like what the Leninists were doing in their groupuscules for 50 years didn't work. Now I'm a Democrat, or vice versa. It's like things have to be more like in flux in your mind, I think. So I don't know if that's a good argument, but I think it's a state of mind.
Yeah, I just think like the Democratic Party as a vehicle needs to looked at like with extreme skepticism, like as like it might be the Titanic, it might have hit an iceberg, and so like maybe you can get that thing if you get into the cockpit and you could steer it to like port, but we should probably be making some plans for it hitting the bottom.
Yeah, contingency plans, more lifeboats. Like that would be a good. That's a good analogy. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see where these debates, go. In particularly the next few months. I mean, I'm not particularly optimistic that it's coming, but I've been trying to agitate for maybe, these Bernie emails have been getting me more excited than they should, and just what makes me excited is not so much even just like dusting off the old t-shirt in the closet, but literally that I'm getting messages from like family members and friends, people who I don't talk politics with that much, who are saying, wow, is there an opportunity for something to open up in American politics? And just being reminded that even, in this really bleak moment where we have, Trump, a more refined Trump coming back into power, that there are a lot of people who are looking and hoping that we can build something different. And there is an energy again. I think people need to take, it seriously because, we're all fairly young, but we've lived through a few cycles on the U.S. left, at least. And, there are people who really, really desperately want to go back to the marginality that sort of, punctuated, our youth. Right. And I'm not going back to that ever again. And I think we need to be very serious about that potential of the left becoming really marginalized because it's too frightened to act and take advantage of the opportunities it has in front of it right now.
Yeah, I think that the real dilemma is how to create, what we used to call a pole of attraction in like this broader field. And for a long time, an independent kind of voice did not seem very possible because it was entirely crowded out. But when one major party seems to lack so much legitimacy, it has to be an opening. There is one there, whether we take advantage of it or not. So the best people can do is launching independent campaigns, organizing in their unions for like more democratic debate about politics. Like it's part of the, risks of like trade union politics is you don't want to alienate union members, so it becomes very narrow. But right now is a moment to be like, what should we do, guys? How to have political conversations in your workplace and workshopping it. And like that's something I know the Labor Notes Conference is really good about this. They do this kind of thing. But thinking about how to use democratic reform caucuses and unions to try to like actually debate what we should do as opposed to assume what we should do. Like that's the beginning of like a genuine political culture in the American working class that at that moment like hasn't existed in a long time, because what the Democratic Party does and why I have so much rage for them is just think about what they did before this election. They blackmail you into voting for them. Like, don't vote. If you don't vote for me, it's fascism. Every fucking election of my life. And then they lie to you about this man's mental health for months and months and months, if not years. And then they nominate somebody and you're not allowed to vote for them. And then it's going to be your fault if the final end of the republic emerges upon the new Trump.
Even if you vote for them, by the way, Lillian,
crazy.
like that's the thing too. Is like even if you vote for them, you weren't enthusiastic enough. You might have criticized them too much, right? It's just a never-ending cycle.
I mean, it's crazy. Like, and it's like enough. It's I hate using therapy speak, but it's abusive. It's mentally abusive. Like I remember I was having this like argument with people after that horrible debate. And I just expressed my like anger, genuine. I'm not even talking about like socialist anger. I'm talking about citizenship anger. Like as an American citizen, I was angry. I'm not angry because I'm on the left or because I want. Like I was just basic stuff. These people are lying and they're engaging in deception and they are treating us like idiots. And then we are all watching this like aghast, like, oh my God, like all those videos of people in bars, like eyes, like mouth open, eyes wide, like that was crazy. And then the first response is, but Trump though. And I'm like, no, no, I have a right to vote for someone who like I think is mentally competent. You can't lie to me about that and then blame me. That's crazy. I mean, me and I think I speak for everybody, honestly. Like, anyway. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just one other thing. Like, I've been rereading a bunch of stuff on the Democrats, including Hitchens' book, No One Left to Lie To, on Bill Clinton. And the Democrats voted for, like, Bill Clinton lied in court. And we're flash forward, we want voters to be upset about Trump doing hush money payments. It's like,
that's crazy.
no, understand what page you're on before you ask other people to get on the right page.
This is what I don't think people understand about Trump. They know he's a bad dude.
Yeah.
They know he's like dysfunctional and chaotic. They know all those things. The problem is that people think Democrats are all those things, and they just are kind of down. Like, for the people who are really down for Trump or don't care, I think they don't care for that reason. Like, that's why, because you don't have any credibility, and at least he's saying, you know, it's like at least he lets it all hang out there. I genuinely feel like that's the mood that I see when I kind of listen to. I don't talk to many people anymore outside the internet because I live in Amsterdam, but you know what I mean. Like when I engage with people.
He got to attack Liz Cheney in the run to a general election.
And Bush, I mean, yeah, it's crazy. It really is. The gifts that they gave this man.
The gifts, yeah. The thing about how she, oh my God, her and her husband, her Dick Cheney, was it that thing about Arab voters and why would you vote for? Oh my God, that was crazy.
I mean, it's horrendous, and they. You know, that political institution, that class of people deserves to be exposed for the frauds that they are. They spent $1 billion and they lost. And now they have the audacity to ask people for more money. Lillian, I wanted to, before we let you go, I definitely want you to talk about what's left of philosophy in a second. But first, I want to ask, you know, all right, the world seems like it's open, history's moving. What should our listeners be reading? Who should they be reading? Any thinkers in particular? Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
God, this is putting me on the spot.
This is one for the
Sorry, Lily,
email, David. You got to let the prep this.
My bad. Definitely.
Who have I been reading that's good? Okay. Okay, so actually it's sitting on my desk, so I'll say this because we talked about the reproductive rights thing. There's a book called Abortion and Women's Choice, The State, Sexuality, and Reproductive Rights. And it's from the 90s by Rosalind Pichetsky. And it's one of the best, like, materialist arguments about, like, just family and fertility and all of the things that are happening in society right now with, like, the demographic crisis and all of this. Like, she really, like, gets the dynamics that could lead to that. I would really recommend this. What else have I been reading? I've been reading some kind of boring work stuff. Give me some ideas, David, because I do read a lot of philosophy books.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell people what I always tell people to read, which is they should read Leo Panich's most recent book, The Socialist Challenge Today, which I think is a really strong one to get people thinking about politics seriously. I mean, I think it's a good time for people to go back and read their Marx. I've been very excited to hear people jumping right back into that. We have a lot of reading series on that. What's up, Matt?
I have one, Lily Geismer. I've already mentioned her a few times, but Don't Blame Us, particular to Massachusetts suburban politics, but also Left Behind goes right into the Bill Clinton, Atari Democrats, Gary Hart, the 80s sort of move away from labor and poverty toward corporations and technology. Probably gave the Democratic Party a terminal case.
You know, I was thinking this is more of a genre of book, but I'm kind of interested in, I'm like into Civil War stuff now and like American Republicanism. And I read a book by James Oakes, and let me get the title of it. Can I go for like 10 seconds and get the title of it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is our language here. as everyone knows, we've been.
I actually just downloaded Lincoln's Lieutenants because George McClellan, I feel like, is the ultimate. Like, he's like sort of the embodiment of the Democratic Party. Just never went to college with all the people in the opposition. Doesn't really want to fight them and wants to figure out like amicable way to do this.
Okay, the book is called The Crooked Path to Abolition. And I was just thinking about that because it was a very enlightening way of looking at how different interpretations of the American Constitution can lead to different kinds of mass politics and how that's possible. And I won't like get poetic about that, but I really like the project of like thinking about what possibilities exist based on the things that people already value and are committed to in the US, because I think there's a lot of energy on the left to like deconstruct it and make it bad. And I believe this to be a necessary step to understanding the reality of that country. But I also think that like there are people in American history that have been done that and gone a step further to try to affirm different interpretations of what the country could be. And I think the lead up to the Civil War and the abolition is one of like the most profound demonstrations of that. And along with that, I recently watched Ethan Hawke's miniseries on John Brown. People should read that. It's very good. Or watch that. It's very good.
Dude, all
what is that called again? I looked that up.
It's something Bird, right?
Something Bird, yeah.
I forget. It's 7 episodes. Ethan Hawke does a great job. John Brown was a fanatic, but it's also like that. It ends with him being hung and saying, "This is a beautiful country." Which is
honestly, I'm such a sap, and like my eyes started watering the second that she said that. I think that this is a really important thing for people to be diving into and reclaiming this history, because the right's trying to sell you a nasty fairy tale, and a lot of people on the Democratic Party side are also trying to deny us our inspiration and heroes that we desperately need right now. Lillian, tell people about the podcast and what's coming up next.
If you don't know me, I have a podcast with my 3 friends, and we make it's called What's Left of Philosophy. And the next episode is on Martin Heidegger. And we have been waiting 3 years to do this episode. So if you all want to listen to it, we're going to put a fun trailer out in the next week.
Well, hell yeah. Y'all should definitely subscribe and not just listen, support them on Patreon. Lillian, really do appreciate you spending some time with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Lillian. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
And joining us today is Briana Last. Briana is a PhD and associate professor at Stony Brook University in psychology. Briana, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you both.
It's good to be talking to you. You co-authored a piece here, a scholarly article with a great title, Therapists' Work Conditions as Patients' Treatment Conditions. That summarizes, I think, that's a really good way of summarizing. I mean, we've talked to nurses who are striking here, and just the way that these sorts of systems are left so shabby. Just talk about the title of your piece.
Yeah, I have to admit that it is borrowing from the Chicago Teachers Union slogan. So the teachers there have sort of coined the slogan, teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions. And obviously, I think there are a lot of parallels in the mental health system. And so I was really inspired by that and inspired by the therapist that we spoke with. And so thought it was an apt title.
Yeah, and so we have a crisis. Before we get to like maybe the positive ways of approaching this, talk to us about the crisis currently facing mental health providers.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Where do I begin? There are so many crises. Well, I mean, first, I think there's just a decades-long increase in demand for mental health services, particularly because social conditions have made it such that more and more people are in distress and feeling unwell. And this surge in demand has not been met with an adequate increase in mental health providers. And so there are not enough clinicians that can meet the demand in aggregate. But something that I think is common to the United States in general is that it's not just that there's a problem of sort of aggregate supply of providers, but that there is an unequal distribution of those providers. And that's the bigger problem in our mental health system, which is that there is, it's kind of a misnomer to even call it one single mental health system. As I'm sure, many of your listeners will know, we have several mental health systems in this country. We have a system for the affluent. So if you are in need of treatment and you have a lot of money to spare, you can go on Psychology Today or however else you may want to find a therapist, and you can find a therapist working in private practice who will charge you a very large fee per session. On average, it's about $140 per session, but that's just a lower conservative estimate. And you can get really high quality care from a provider who's doing pretty well for themselves. If you are a worker, you have a different healthcare system, essentially. You have a system where your employer provided health insurance restricts the kind of provider that you can see. And you are often going to be struggling to find a provider who's willing to accept your insurance in network, because insurance companies are really difficult to deal with. They surveil therapists. They don't provide them with adequate compensation. ProPublica has been doing a lot of really great work, kind of exposing how challenging it is to provide therapy, and how insurers make it really difficult for them. You're still probably going to be getting a lot higher reimbursement if you are a therapist working for a private commercial insurance company. Now, if you are uninsured or insured by Medicaid, you have even fewer options, because Medicaid reimbursement rates and chronic underfunding of mental health is abysmal in this country. And so providers who serve the Medicaid or uninsured population are extremely overworked and underpaid. And they're the kinds of providers you might encounter in a community mental health agency or a federally qualified health center. Those providers are essentially working for somewhat higher than McDonald's wages, and they're seeing, anywhere up to, 90 to 100 patients on their caseloads. And then the other kind of sad truth is that a lot of our mental health services are delivered in correctional facilities in this country as well. So in total, sorry, I've sort of this digression, but we basically have this extremely unequal system where we have relative abundance for the affluent. They have their choice of providers who are doing fairly well for themselves, but this is a kind of slim, section of the provider workforce. And then there's the rest of the workforce that's working, for much lower wages under much more difficult conditions. And depending on the kind of patient that they're providing care for, the lower you get, the more difficult your conditions are. And that's where we really see the crisis, which is that our wealthy friends, and colleagues are getting adequate access to care for the most part. But if you are a worker or uninsured or Medicaid insured, you are simply out of luck in terms of getting a provider.
So Briana, I just want to ask, on the spectrum of care that's really stressed right now for, low wage workers, working class folks, where I don't want to make you pick between the two, but could you talk about the second role here, which is that, people need mental health care, but they also probably need a lot of other help, with food, with, any kind of, security in their life. I mean, could you talk about how that, one, creates strain on the system, and two, also creates strain on the actual treatment of a patient?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think certainly folks that are serving the Medicaid insured population and the uninsured, encounter pretty constantly this, the fact that like their patients don't have their basic needs met. And so oftentimes they're sort of asked to do therapy and they're like, well, my patient's depressed because they don't have a house, you know, or like my patient's depressed because, which is like, you know, there potentially could be some mental health support that they could receive, but for the most part,
but you're not really like diving into the unconscious, right? Like if, you know, if you're in a situation like that, I mean, it's very present.
Totally. I mean, and I think like, you know, because I'm a provider, I'm probably biased, but I do think like people need both often. And I think most of the time there is a dialectical relation between the two. And I think that most therapists do feel like, yeah, this is helpful, but it's just such a small piece of the work that needs to be done. And our systems are just so fractured. And first of all, they're extremely underfunded. Our welfare state has been extremely privatized and been sort of subject to austerity. And so there's often very little support that we can provide people. And so oftentimes mental health support takes the place of some social service support. And that often is sort of discomforting for providers. But often providers then get sort of pulled into the role of being a case manager as well. And that's one of the things that, you know, we heard from providers in our studies that Matt sort of talked about, which is that people need more time to provide that wraparound support that they often are not sort of compensated or reimbursed for, but is really necessary for the patient in providing them sort of like holistic care, but doesn't count because an insurer or a payer is not willing to sort of reimburse them for that time.
Yeah, I mean, one observation I have is, you know, I started a meditating practice back in college, and I'll just say it was much easier to meditate when my bank account was full of student loan money than when I started having to find a job because rent was due and I was really low. It was tough to meditate at that, and I think probably mental health in general it becomes a much difficult proposition. But you know, that kind of gets to a class issue. The other thing I got in trouble for is when Ted Lasso, or Jason Sudeikis as Ted Lasso, went to the White House and used the White House press briefing room to say what we need to do is lower or like make it more acceptable to seek treatment. And I think that is fine in a vacuum, but clearly I think the biggest impediment to most people I talk to isn't that they're embarrassed to get it. It's that they don't have the time in their life and the money in their accounts to pursue this type of treatment. Like that seems like the biggest divide right now. And I'm curious how much this would play into it. Like a Medicare for all or a single payer, some type of system, because it can't just be through this hodgepodge, right? Like we need something that can provide this to people beyond just like encouraging them with fictional TV characters.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been long frustrated with, which is this idea that stigma is the ultimate barrier to people seeking care. Obviously, I think stigma does play a role. I think that there are certainly also specific conditions that are more pathologized, and I think that that is a barrier. I think there's also a lot of, you know, not misinformation, but, you know, people don't really know about sort of what mental health support can do, and there's sort of ideas about what it can do. So I think those play a role, but a really small one. I think the bigger challenge, as you've said, is the fact that care is highly inaccessible. And it's most inaccessible in rural areas in the country, in socially disadvantaged areas. You know, I think one study that I looked at found that 65% of non-metropolitan counties in the U.S. lacks a psychiatrist. You know, that's disturbing in a country that is so wealthy. You know, that is not okay, that there's just such an inequitable distribution of providers and resources such that there are large, you know, areas in the country where they can't even like access a provider because no provider exists.
Yeah, and you know, I watched Bill Clinton's State of the Union in 1999, and he's talking about how we need to look at this mental health stuff. There's a lot of words toward it. Who are the bosses here? And I think probably the different sort of levels of that you kind of outlined earlier, of like a class stratum of mental health. But who are the bosses here before we get into what people are doing to organize?
Yeah, so many different ones. I mean, again, it depends on sort of what system of care or subsystem of care we're talking about. People who work in private practice that accept, out of pocket or self-pay are their own bosses. So they are essentially small business owners, and they determine how much care they provide. They have a lot of autonomy. And mental health providers are 6 times as likely to not accept insurance as physical health care providers. There are lots of reasons for that. There are not that many overhead costs to providing mental health care. You don't need like a phlebotomist. You don't need like, technology or equipment. You just need to talk to someone. And so it makes it much easier for people to sort of be standalone clinics, as it were. So for that stratum of mental health providers, they are their own bosses. For people who work in large healthcare systems, obviously, the CEOs of hospitals and their sort of middle management are their bosses. One thing that I think is really important to mention is that there has been a long road to privatization that has existed. So, when we talk about people who are publicly insured, they're not necessarily seeing providers in public systems. So it used to be the case that people used to go to sort of state-owned facilities or public clinics, and that workforce was part of the broader public sector. So, New York City still has sort of remnants of this, and lots of areas around the country have sort of their mental health providers as part of the broader public sector workforce. But there's been steady privatization for the past several decades, such that now, increasingly nonprofits are delivering publicly funded services. So a lot of this was sort of accelerated by the Great Recession. So Rahm Emanuel, I think is being floated around for DNC chair. In the wake of the Great Recession, he closed 6 of the Chicago's public clinics. New York State has seen a 31% decline in state-owned mental health facilities since 1990. So there's been a really intense sort of decline in state capacity. And so now a lot of services that were once sort of publicly provided are now within nonprofits. So that's been a kind of more recent change sort of in the neoliberal era where, these public goods that were once part of a broader public sector are now being delivered in these sort of smaller nonprofits.
And I mean, what ends up being the result of this? I mean, I'm sure, it affects care, but also in terms of access for the general population.
Yeah, I mean, all of the above, right? Like it decreases access to care. There have been studies showing that austerity and privatization have resulted in decreased capacity of these systems. We'll talk about organizing in a second, but it's also resulted in a huge loss of union jobs. Pay in the public sector has, for the most part, been higher than in the nonprofit sector. And that continues to be the case, despite the fact that there's been relatively more investment in mental health care in recent years. It's still the case that if you work in the public sector, you're going to make more. And you're also going to get all these fringe benefits like a pension, really good health care. And so fewer providers want to work in these community mental health centers that are nonprofits, that are underfunded, where you're overworked and underpaid. And so that affects care. These clinics are experiencing intense turnover and mass public sector exit, where people are just like, I don't want to work in this like small nonprofit where I'm getting like overworked. I have a caseload of like 100 people. Like 10 of them are experiencing like suicidal distress, and I can't tolerate that. And I also don't feel like I'm giving my best self and my best care. And so there's moral injury where people feel like, they're sort of betraying the values that brought them into the work, and they're feeling like they're delivering substandard care. And so providers are increasingly less likely to want to work in these kinds of settings as well.
And it seems like, and we can get to the unionizing, because these sorts of things don't seem to be, I think, getting better through technology. I think maybe worse, like turning them into gig workers through like
Right.
better help, or like have AI just talk to people. So what are people doing? Or if you want to comment on either of those before we get into the labor.
Yeah, so one of the things that has been a real challenge since the advent of sort of teletherapy, and there's been a huge sort of rush to invest from like venture capital in the sort of like platform economy and digital mental health products. These community mental health clinics, they have always experienced sort of chronic underfunding and a lot of turnover. But one of the things that they could rely on is the fact that if you're a social worker or a mental health counselor, after you graduate from your degree, state licensing boards typically require that you get about sort of 2 years of supervised clinical hours. And so these clinics used to sort of rely on these recent graduates who would sort of be willing to work for low wages because they needed supervised hours. After that 2-year stint, typically those folks would sort of transition into private practice. But what's happened during the pandemic is that increasingly private practices and digital mental health platforms are sort of willing to provide the supervision, the quality of which, who knows, but they're willing to provide that. And so these clinics are starved for clinicians because they used to rely on this sort of exploitative system, but nonetheless one that sort of worked, where they could know, okay, we're going to get like 40 social work graduate students next year, so we'll be able to staff our clinic. Now people are turning to BetterHelp and the sort of platform economy because they can get better work hours. They can work from home. They don't have to deal with the difficulties of working in a community mental health center where patients have lots of needs that are, often difficult and often sort of related to their social conditions. So that these sort of digital mental health platforms have actually kind of starved the public sector and have accelerated a lot of the public sector exit that we've seen.
Who could have imagined that the private sector wouldn't just be additive to this sort of stuff? But so mental health providers are organizing, Briana.
They are, yes, which is very exciting. So yeah, two kind of notes on this. Well, first, I think, I'm sure many of your listeners are aware that in 2023, last year, we saw the largest healthcare worker strike in U.S. history among Kaiser workers. They had a 3-day kind of fixed duration strike, and that included kind of all healthcare workers at Kaiser in California, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Virginia, and D.C., which was really exciting. And I think really speaks to the fact that, providers are feeling stretched thin. They were willing to endure the sort of temporary moment during the pandemic's acute phase where they kind of knew, okay, I have to make this sacrifice. I have to work a little bit harder. But enough is enough. We've sort of done our part, and we haven't received any sort of returns for that and for making those sacrifices. And inflation has only gone up, and costs of living have only gone up, especially in these cities, especially in California, and people need to be paid fair wages. And one of the things that we consistently heard from providers in our study, which I'll talk about, is, people are also advocating for better treatment conditions for their clients in this sort of labor activity. So that was a big thing we heard in the Kaiser strike, is like, we need safe staffing. And that was one of the things they won in that strike was, more adequate staffing ratios so that they could, ensure that the quality of care that they were delivering was up to standards that was, important to them and these providers. So that happened in 2023. In 2022, mental health workers also struck in Northern California at Kaiser. And that was really exciting to see. The National Union of Healthcare Workers has really been behind a lot of this fantastic organizing. And as we speak, over 2,400 mental health workers are on strike in Southern California, also at Kaiser, also with the National Union of Healthcare Workers. And basically they're demanding, we want the same kinds of raises and safe staffing conditions that our Northern California counterparts won. So there's been a lot of labor activity. And because of that, my colleagues and I wanted to do a study not at Kaiser, which is a sort of quasi nonprofit, mega nonprofit, large healthcare provider, we wanted to sort of go into the public mental health system and get a sense from providers in that system, you know, what are some of the workplace challenges they're experiencing and what are they fighting for in their labor organizing efforts. And I mean, it was amazing to learn from these clinicians. I mean, they are doing the Lord's work. They're seeing, you know, sometimes hundreds of clients at a time. They're trying to balance, you know, meeting all of their mental health needs while also meeting all their social support needs. And, you know, the biggest issues are obviously always wages because, you know, they want to sustain this work in the long term. And if they're going to continue to be underpaid, they can't do that. But a lot of the things that they talked about were also around sort of productivity expectations, getting time to be able to do some of that kind of case management work for their clients so that they could support them as whole people. They also talked about the fact that they were fighting for, you know, when a patient dies, which is like a really sad reality of this work, they need some time to mourn that and not just like jump right back in when they're sort of distracted and grieving from their clients. You know, they also talked about just having sort of more voice and agency in their workplaces. So feeling like decisions about healthcare for patients were not up to them and that MBAs were deciding sort of how care would be delivered, not clinicians who were sort of on the ground. And so that was like another big thing that people talked about. And in general, you know, clinicians really felt like this organizing made them feel more connected to the mission of their agencies and sort of what brought them into the work, and feeling like a lot of their autonomy and their sense of self-efficacy in the work that they were doing was sort of being deprived by the sort of increasingly difficult work conditions of community mental health work.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, a lot of my understanding is from fictional representations, but talking among therapists about that stuff seems like about like difficult cases seems like just a natural avenue for, you know, what about our broader work conditions? And like, it seems obvious to me that you would not want your therapist to be constrained in any way by the business school graduates directly above them. And I don't know why that's hard to get, I mean, I know why, because the people with the money don't want people to hear that, oh, you're concerned about your nurses and your medical health professionals being overworked. But we should be investing a lot more into these systems. I think, Briana, is there any place we should point people? Your piece is going to be out. It's not out yet, but in which journal is this here?
Yeah, it's going to be in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, which is a real kind of like social justice journal. Excuse me, I'm going to grab some water. But yeah, it's going to be there. There's a working paper online for folks who are interested in learning a little bit more about the study. And yeah, it was just like a real honor to talk to these folks and that they sort of let us in. So I just want to like say thanks to all the therapists who were willing to speak, and also the kind of labor groups that were willing to kind of open us up to the members. I think that it was really inspiring to hear how much they really are fighting for their patients. You know, they're fighting for themselves, obviously, but they're fighting for their patients' lives and integrity, for them to have really good, high quality care. And I'm just like thrilled to see this uptick in labor activity, and I really hope it sustains.
Absolutely. Well, Briana, last, thank you so much. We'll put a link to that paper in the description.
Yeah, thank you both.